Now, our speaker tonight, Sam Gwynne, or S.C. Gwynne, lives in Austin, Texas. He is a prolific writer. He has written for Time magazine for 12 years, where he won a National Headliners Award for his reporting on the Columbine shootings. He's also written for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Dallas Morning News, San Francisco Chronicle. He was executive director for the Texas Monthly between 2000 and 2008. Where he wrote on various high-profile subjects, from Karl Rove to the Bush White House to the infamous Houston surgeon Eric Sheffey, aka Dr. Evil, and this was included in Harper Perennial Press's Best American Crime Writing anthology in 2006. Gives you an idea of what the doctor was up to. Sam Gwynne comes from a varied background. He first started out as a French teacher, then he was in international banking, and that led to his career in journalism because he says he was one of the few people who could write who didn't mind writing about financial issues. So among other books, several books on financial issues, and his last book was Empire of the Summer Moon, which is about Quanah Parker and the Comanche Indian Nation, the rise and fall of the Comanche Indian Nation in the 19th century. And this was a New York Times bestseller and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, which gave him a lot of latitude to choose his topic for tonight. His latest work is Rebel Yell, The Violence, Passion, and Redemption of Stonewall Jackson, which was released today. That's right, you are the first audience in his 15th city tour. The first audience to hear Sam Gwynne talk about Stonewall Jackson. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Very nice. It worked. I would like to invite you tonight to imagine Thomas J. Jackson as he might have looked to the world on Thursday, April 11th, 1861. That's one day before the Civil War began. He's 37. He's thin enough that you might have called him gaunt. He's about 6 feet tall, which makes him about 5 inches taller than the average adult male of his day. You would have noticed his pale blue-gray eyes, his thin lips, which always seemed to be tightly pressed together. You would have also noticed his large hands and feet, so large he did not seem to know what to do with them. You would have found him, as everyone did, shy and very quiet. His silence was the most striking thing about him. You would have found it difficult to engage him, mostly because he refused to go along with even the most routine conventions of everyday conversation. He refused to say that he wished that anything was different than it was, meaning he could not bring himself to wish that it were warmer or colder outside than it was, or even that some accident had not happened. If you said, "Boy, it would be nice if it stopped raining," he might respond, "Yes, if the maker of the weather thinks it best," thus instantly killing the conversation. He wouldn't say anything bad about anyone else, even when goaded to do it, which meant that he could not participate in even the most rudimentary forms of gossip. He refused to talk about himself. He could be maddeningly literal. When someone used the term "you know" in conversation, he would interrupt to point out that he did not, in fact, know. He was even worse in large groups. When he stood to speak in a public forum, he often faltered and stammered and was forced to sit down without finishing. But then he would often rise again and try again, only to sputter and fail even more miserably and sit down again, red-faced and embarrassed, while everyone around him cringed and looked away. Wherever he was, at precisely 9 o'clock in the evening, he would excuse himself and go home, even if someone was in the middle of a sentence. These were the mild eccentricities. He was obsessed with his own health. He sought water cures at mineral springs all over the country, drinking and soaking in healing waters. He often ate nothing more than cold water and stale bread, or sometimes buttermilk and stale bread, or sometimes cold meat and stale bread. He would bring his own food to dinner parties. He obsessed about anything involving his body, starting with his eyes and digestive system, but including his throat, liver, kidneys, blood, and nervous system. He inhaled glycerin and nitrate of silver. He swallowed ammonia. He once became convinced that one side of him was heavier than the other, and thus did exercises in order to even that out, some of which involved leaping and hopping. Though he did have some genuine physical ailments, his brother-in-law, D.H. Hill, believed that he was a hypochondriac. In spite of all this, he managed to hold a job as a college professor at a military school called the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. He taught a course called Natural and Experimental Philosophy. We would call it physics today, more or less, which included the most difficult scientific and mathematical concepts of the day, including electricity, magnetics, acoustics, optics, and astronomy. Though accounts of his eccentricities sometimes differ, there is no disagreement that he was one of the absolutely worst teachers that anyone had ever seen. He did not really teach at all. He just assigned brutally difficult assignments and then had the students come up and do recitations at the blackboard. He insisted on rote memorization. When the students asked him for an explanation, he would simply recite the precise words from the textbook which he had committed to memory. And now you might think that such a stickler for detail was also a stickler for discipline. But in fact, the reverse was true. His classes were often pure pandemonium. When he turned his back, spitballs would fly. Cadets would walk behind him, mimicking his strange step. In his artillery class, the cadets would often remove the linchpins from the cannons, and so the various pieces would go rolling and spinning down the hill with the professor flailing along in pursuit. You would have said that this man, this Major Thomas J. Jackson, was, if not a loser, something close to it. To call him a failure is too harsh. There were stories that he had had distinguished service in the Mexican War 15 years before. But he just wasn't very good at anything. He was part of that great undifferentiated mass of second-rate humanity who weren't going anywhere in life. And though he never changed his behavior to match that of Lexington society, over the decade that he taught at VMI, and by the way, that is VMI as it looked before the war and before the Yankees burned it, during the time that he was there, the decade he was there, the town kind of adapted itself to him. He was a harmless, decent, church-going man. He even ran a Sunday school for slaves. In his own way, Lexington got used to him and even came to appreciate him. He was a curiosity, a sort of minor civic institution. What you would not have known if you were walking the streets of Lexington, Virginia in April of 1861, and this is what it looked like just immediately pre-war Lexington. Jackson's house is a little that way and his church is a little that way. What you would not have known in April of 61 was that all of the preceding descriptions of Jackson are almost ridiculously incomplete. They do not begin to describe him. They would not have begun to capture who he really was. Because while Lexington knew the caricature Jackson, the health crank, the unbending professor, the social bore with high Christian principles, the women in his life, his two wives and his sister-in-law, saw someone else entirely. This is Ellie, his first wife. He lost her in childbirth, giving birth to a stillborn son. This is her sister, Maggie, with whom Jackson was in love but could not marry because of the rules of the Presbyterian Church, later to become one of the most famous poets in America. This is Anna, his second wife. Seen here with the daughter, Julia, who would be born later during the war. Concealed behind that carefully constructed social front was a passionate and deeply sensitive man. Jackson loved Shakespeare and the architecture of Gothic cathedrals. When he did a tour of Europe, he paid almost no attention to battlefields. It was all cathedrals and art. He was self-taught and completely fluent in Spanish. He was a first-rate gardener. He had a 19th century romantic's embrace of beauty and nature, glorying in sunsets and mountain views. He had an almost mystical sense of God to whom he consecrated every waking act of his life. Behind closed doors, he would joke and laugh uproariously. He loved to play with children